there's probably two answers to that. Where do I think it's going and where would I like to see it going? So where I think it's going is that like the last 15, 20 years since I've been in this industry, things have changed, but they're also like quite marginal improvements. The real changes or the real change comes when you change the underlying process. Because as I mentioned before, is that we stack technologies on an existing process, but the real question to first ask is that process right? And I think the same is true with research, which I think that what we will see is as we start to see some of the data processing innovations, some of the innovations with AI, and then access to some of the data with biology, we'll probably likely get bigger insights. And then it's a question of how do we translate those into perhaps even trialless or patientless trials in which they're like, organoids on a chip and so on and so forth. And I think that what we'll probably find is that those type of innovations will happen and speed things up. But ultimately, for this foreseeable future, I think people will need to be a part of that in some capacity until we can
Hello and welcome to Meet the Medicine Makers. I'm Menashe, an early career drug discovery scientist, and this podcast shares real stories from people behind how medicines are made, from early research through to real-world impact. Today, I'm joined by Liam Eves, a clinical trial expert who has basically worked across almost every part of the clinical trials delivery process, from patient recruitment to site management to operational leadership and innovation in clinical research. In this episode, we'll explore the realities of running clinical trials. While clinical trials continue to become slower and more expensive despite advances in technology, and what Liam believes needs to change to make clinical trials more efficient and more patient-focused. Liam, thank you so much for joining me.
No, thank you so much for the invite and having me on. I appreciate it.
So to start with, how did you first get into clinical trials and what drew you into the space?
Yeah, I think like most people in our space, that everyone falls into it, or the vast majority of people fall into it. So my life began very differently. Is when I left school at 16 to play professional football, and so I played professional football for 4 or 5 years before I got injured. And then I went into sports science because that seemed to be an interesting area to go into. And then I started picking up the psychology aspects of that in sports psych, and then sort of veered and detoured along my sort of academic career into neuroscience and neuropsych. And my intention was actually to go in to become a neuropsychologist. And after pursuing that for some time, I was working at a site that did a lot of memory. It was basically specialized in a healthcare service for memory. So assessing patients with dementia subtypes to understand, and then providing care services for them. Basically, they one day asked me, they said, "Oh, can you be involved in this study?" And I was like, "Sure." What the hell is a study? Like, what are you trying to do? And was sort of thrown into the deep end. In all honesty, I like to solve problems, and God knows there's a lot of them. So what eventually happened was I was just being thrown into different areas to try and solve the problems for these research studies that we were delivering at a number of sites that we had. And honestly, that's just where it happened. Is I think I follow the problems rather than I am the problem. Yeah, that's what I've honestly been doing for the last, God, it's close to 20 years now. Is basically going through the process and understanding where are the problems and how do we fix that. So I've spent 20 years running site management organizations, CROs, clinical trial technology companies, trying to innovate in the space. And now I've spent the last sort of 6 years advising organizations and building a couple of companies in the process.
You mentioned some of the different parts that you've worked across. For someone who might not know a lot about clinical trials and the different areas, site management, what do these different parts involve?
Yeah, so effectively should we say three groupings. There is your sponsor that is responsible for developing the drug, right? So they're going to understand what the compound, understand the therapeutic area that it's going to hopefully tackle and help. Then you have the contract research organizations, or think of these as services that take on the responsibility of the pharmaceutical company to actually run the clinical trials. So this is a lot of project management, coordination, medical oversight, medical monitoring, um, and things like supporting with the regulations. And then there's the sites that are the ones that are subcontracted from the CROs to actually deliver the study, and they're responsible for interacting with the patients and effectively extracting data. Because when you really think about what the clinical trial process is, it's about how do we understand the impact of a drug on an individual, and that individual is expressed through data. And everything that we do, in all honesty, is to get us to the leaflet that exists inside of the packet of a drug, right? So when you get your drug and you look at that leaflet, all the information there is basically summarized from 15 or however many years it's taken to develop that. Because the compound existed years and years and years ago, and that's what we were struggling with. It's the words on the document and what it means for the patient in terms of things like side effects and the mechanisms of action. Is what we try and we get through that process.
And you've described yourself as a problem solver, and you've
Mm.
also openly spoken about the sort of challenges that are in clinical trials. What are the problems and,
So much.
and challenges?
Oh my gosh.
Briefly.
How long have we got? So I like to think in frameworks. I think frameworks are really important because they allow us to anchor specific problems too. So maybe what we can do is I can talk a little bit about the frameworks, the categories of problems, and then we can dive in as we sort of see fit. So from a complexity perspective, is that like, or from even from a foundational perspective, we're working on human biology, right? And this is an extremely complex system that has evolved from billions over billions and billions of years, right? So it's very hard to actually understand what is going on with the body. You know, we're getting so much better at understanding it, but it's massively complex. And there's obviously some slight individual variation as well to that, right? So that's like one thing. That's one category, biological complexity. The next is then, and rightly so, we need a regulatory framework. So it's like we need those things to understand exactly what we can do and what we can't do and the paths that we need to take. And that in itself is highly complex to navigate and understand, and not to mention that each country will have its different sets of, requirements, regulations, and what have you. Then you've got a third category, which is looking at things like the incentive structure. So, like, it's a case of, as mentioned before, there's like three main actors with the sponsor, the CRO, and the sites, and they all have slightly different incentives. So the sponsor is like, okay, how do we get the drug? Ultimately, it should be everyone's directive to say, how do we get this drug to market, or at least understand whether it works or not. But then how things like the contracts are structured incentivize different behaviors from different organizations. And that's like a real super, because it's psychologically based, right? It's how we perceive the thing. Then when you look at the system as a whole, it was designed a long time ago in terms of how we go through these process. And the challenge with that is that we build upon that process in today's environment when it's a different environment than what it was. So good example for, let's say, for instance, for a diabetic study. Before there was standard of care for diabetes, to write a protocol and to access those patients would have been relatively easy because there was no standard of care, right? It was people were saying, okay, this sounds interesting. This sounds like it may help me. Therefore, let me go and see if I can get access to this novel and new medication. Whereas that's not necessarily the stage or the era that we're in now, right? We're in the era of precision medicine. So we start to compete against standard of care. Like you'll hear a lot of people in the industry and they'll say, okay, well, what are the other, what are the other trials that are happening on in currently that we're competing against? And that is one competition element, but the other is the standard of care that an individual that has which sort of like leads to the next sort of category, which is around the psychological dimension of patients. So when we think about that diabetic example, is that you can think of it as like a matrix in which you have along the y-axis, you would have things like the disease severity that is perceived by the individual. And along the x-axis, you would have something like the how well the condition is controlled with current standard of care. So what's really interesting is that if an individual is not controlled and doesn't have there's no standard of care, they're going to be highly motivated to take part, right? But if their disease is well controlled, well maintained, then where's the motivation? So the patient psychological aspect is also another factor that's based around the great work that has been done over the last 30, 40 years in drug discovery. And then you start to wrap it all up to say, well, okay, who are the people that are delivering the studies on the shop floor, so to speak? And it's the healthcare system, right? And those healthcare systems are the vast majority of researchers. They are not just researchers. That's almost a hobby in some ways, and I don't mean to belittle that, but it's like they have a job as well, which is delivering healthcare. So then you've got that aspect, which is individuals are trying to do their best with the time that they have. And then the final point is patience. I don't know many other industries where we rely so heavily on the volunteering of individuals to be able to deliver a product. The army, yes, maybe, but they're paid for it. It becomes a job. So I don't know. I don't know many industries that. So it's massively complex. Fundamentally, is an extremely complex space, and I certainly don't know of any other industry, because I've tried to find some that like share all or even 50% of the challenges that I mentioned.
You've mentioned that there's a lot of people focus in clinical trials. You have to be able to work productively with people. And in your personal experience, how have you gone about sort of doing that successfully? Because I guess the success of a trial is dependent on people volunteering, people being motivated, it being delivered efficiently.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think that there's like motivation is a really important factor, and I'm going to use that like to cover a few things. One of them is the patients, and the second is the actual people that are delivering the work. Those two things need to be balanced pretty well in order for people to be engaged and want to take part, and whether that's the patient, as say, or the actual staff members, because it varies hugely. So, for instance, if you're trying to deliver a study that as a site that doesn't pay well, and you have, which is well-known fact, that cash flow is very difficult at a site level, and you've got another sponsor that's paying well, in the sense that it's paying for all the things that you need to be doing, then you're going to prioritize that because it brings in more cash. Or if you've got a sponsor that is paying on time or even quicker, like, within a month rather than 3-6 months, which is not uncommon, again, you're going to prioritize that because it gets cash in the bank sooner. From the patient perspective, I think that ultimately my view is that patients, and again, it depends on the condition. So I don't want to but as a heuristic, I think that there's a level of trust, and that trust determines engagement in a lot of ways. So what I mean by that is, um, when we look at funnels, so effectively, we have different funnels for different mechanisms to attract patients into research, right? So it could be a case of an online advertisement. That funnel is going to be extremely wide at the top, and it gets very narrow at the bottom quite quickly because there's no trust that's been established. So the typical process is, there's an ad. I've just seen an ad. Oh, I have that condition. Click. Oh yeah, answer these 5 questions. Click, and it's done, right? Top of mind, it's done, and I forgot about it. I may get an email along with the 55,000 other emails that I receive, and it's lost. It's gone. Then I get a call, and I'm busy. I'm working. It's 9 to 5, and it's like, listen, can you call me back later? I'm just not, my level of motivation is not as peaked, and I don't have that trust with the individual on the other side of the phone. Whereas when you look at it from, say, for instance, if you have been part of a clinical trial before, or you're part of a healthcare practices database, and someone rings you up and says, "Hey, hey Liam, it's such and such from the GP surgery." I'm going to listen because I've been there. They take care of me. I know the doctors and the nurses and what have you there. I'm going to give them my time, and I'll register that and comprehend what they're asking quicker. So therefore, the conversion increases massively. So I think that trust is a massive factor, and a good story that from this is that, um, so I used to work in, as mentioned, uh, neuroscience research. One of those areas was Alzheimer's, and this one time, a patient had come through. We had assessed her 6 months before. She came into the room with her daughter. She'd been interested in a particular trial that we'd come and brought her in for. So there was trust that had been started to be established. And she came into the waiting room, and she was extremely, like, she just seemed to be like not quite with it. And she wasn't so severe that she would have been acting like that. And her daughter seemed like visibly stressed. And this visit was a pre-screening visit to let them know about what was going to happen and so on and so forth. So I went into the room with them, and I could see a daughter, it's called Karen, getting a bit notably agitated. And I just sort of stopped. I was like, "Hey guys, listen, now I'm going to get a coffee." The tension needed to be broken. I was like, "I'm going to get coffee. Do you guys want a coffee?" They were like, "Yeah, yeah." So brought them a coffee, and then proceeded not to talk about the study. I just wanted to find out if they were okay. So, I asked them the question. It turned out it'd been a really stressful day for them all. They'd been rushing around, and it was like, "Hey guys, right, we've just, we had that chat," and I was like, "Listen, just let's rebook you in, and next week when it's a bit quieter, and let's have that conversation." And now that isn't necessarily a thing that's done or paid for in research. There's no line item to say, "Hey, have a conversation, build that rapport, that relationship, and understand the individual." Um, so what happened was that I had built a level of trust with them because I cared. I wanted what was best for them. And they came back the next week. We had the conversation. We, went through all the information, and they ultimately like went on the study, but not on just that study, on many other studies after it, because that relationship has been built. So I think that it doesn't matter what we do, whether it's sites or whether it's patients or whether it's our counterparts. It's about how do we build that level of trust with individuals where we're honest and open, and we communicate well, and we take the time for individuals. And I think that that's really important. I think that's really important. It's a human requirement across any industry, not just ours.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think anyone who works with people, interacts with people, needs to be able to build trust. And would you have any advice on how to do that, even if it's advice that's not even directly linked to working in clinical trials?
Yeah, I think it's honestly about just being authentic, right? I think there's a lot of the big challenge is that, at least this is my perception, is that um it's things like vulnerability is people don't like showing those things, but it's actually a sign of strength to show them as an example. So let's say for instance, might have a meeting with one of my team, and I can go and say to them, right guys, this is a problem. We're going to sort it out. And I can be really quite aggressive and, and we're going to do this thing. And I don't know that that's the right answer, but I can approach it like I do know or believe that it's the right answer, which there's a level then of like, is Liam being like, does he know? Because it falls back, then the trust goes because they can't count on my leadership. Whereas if I go in and say, listen, this is a problem, what do we all think about it? What do we think? Is it the real problem we're trying to solve? And we have a conversation, it becomes a lot easier then to the best ideas win. Equally, I think just actually caring for someone and caring for people and trying to help individuals is, it's what do they call it? Man, it's like a, can't remember the name of it now, but it's like social currency. It is that, you're effectively, you think about it from an evolutionary perspective, when we were in smaller little tribes, it was a case of, if I help you, then the likelihood of us both surviving is greater. And if I can trust on you to have my back, just as you can trust me to have yours, then it makes us stronger. And I think that fighting for those things I don't think it's as complicated actually as it needs to be. But it's being authentic.
And we've discussed like being a problem solver and, being able to build connections with people. It sounds like you have to be able to build connections with the people you're working with and the people who are taking part in your trials. But are there any other skills that you would say are really key to sort of doing well in clinical trials delivery?
Pause, because I think that there's like it's in. I'll use a football analogy for a second, right? If I really want to play as a goalkeeper, but I'm 5 foot tall, right? I'm not going to be a goalkeeper. I might be able to be another position, but I won't be able to be a goalkeeper because I don't have those attributes. And I think that what's important is that, thankfully, that to deliver trials, we need to be different in our skill set. And that's what makes it great, is that the skill set of a doctor needs to be extremely knowledgeable, very deeply knowledgeable about particular areas to understand those conditions. Whereas an individual that is maybe, let's say, for instance, on the patient recruitment side, needs to be skilled at advertising. So I think that ultimately it depends, is the honest answer, on what you want to do. I think that the things that are at least the best people that I've ever seen across industries are curious, they are hardworking, and they will, when they approach a problem, they are become very clear on what that problem is. So often is that we'll just dive in with a whole bunch of assumptions to say, okay, this is the problem that we want to solve. Let's solve for that. And then you find out that some of your assumptions are wrong, and therefore you're solving the wrong problem. So an example of this was, and I've spoken about this before, is that we had um, a, a trial came to us many years ago for overactive bladder. And what had happened is that they was failing to recruit, and they had brought on a couple of our sites as a rescue sites to deliver. And what was in that protocol was that individuals had to have an overactive bladder. I think that they had to be on a particular medication, and the study medication that they were going to take had the potential to make their memory worse. Okay, so that was like, so as part of the protocol, they had bundled in it memory assessments, and they were bundled in it as a, I'm going to, tell you about this study, and I'm also going to say, hey, listen, just while you're here as well, we're going to do some memory assessments, and it might take about another 3 hours to do those, right? So it's like massively off-putting. So the problem that it came to us with was we can't recruit this study. That was a very generalized problem. But when you start to unpick it, you say, well, okay, why can you not recruit it? Oh, we're not having the patients. Well, what are the patients that you're looking for? We're looking for patients with overactive bladder. Well, what are their drivers and motivators to be involved in a study that's going to take this long and take this amount of time every visit? Well, they'll get access to this drug, but the drug's only like he's got a 1-to-1 ratio. Like, there's only 50% chance they're going to get it, and there's a load of therapies already on the market for this that can be relatively well controlled. And they were looking in the wrong space. And what we did is that we were like, okay, that memory assessment has been seen as a negative. It's actually a massive value add to patients, to the right patients that are concerned about their memory. So that was something that would be a benefit to a certain group of patients. So all we had to do was surface that and then start looking for patients that matched the criteria and that were worried well about their memory. And then they had previously done like 9 months and got a handful of patients. We recruited in about 6 weeks of going live because we changed the framing, because we understand the problem better. And that's what I mean about sometimes like the problem solving. That's like such a great, because ultimately in research or in life in general, there's always problems that you're going to encounter, and you want people that are curious, observant enough, and relentless to be able to overcome those things.
And it sounds like you need to be able to sort of shift your perspective. What can initially look like a problem can actually be some of your biggest assets.
Absolutely, and there's a great experiment in a, I think it's in psychology actually, where they give people, I don't know if you've seen this, where they give people a box of matchsticks with like one matchstick in it, and then they give them a candle and a drawing pin, and they say, okay, we want you to attach this candle to the wall and light it. I don't know if you've
No,
seen this
I'm
before.
also like, I haven't seen
Okay,
this. I'm also
okay.
curious.
Okay, so what typically happens is people see the pin and then go, okay, we'll attach the rope part of the candle to the wall and set it on fire, but then it doesn't stand because the wick burns, right? And then it drops. And the problem is, to your point about the reframe, is that they see the match as a way of lighting the candle. They don't see the box as a solution for that. So the solution is you take the box apart, you pin the box to the wall, you stand the candle on it, and then you light the flame. So the reframe is that, like, is what is really important. It's been one of the biggest like learnings for me, is that whenever you're faced with a problem, is that you're too young to know the A-team, but for anyone who's like older, is that they would get stuck in an area, they would have literally just whatever was in a barn and they'd come out with a tank somehow. And it's like, that's the sign of mentality that you need, is you need to look at all the things you have in your arsenal, in your toolkit, and the different ways in which each of them can be used. And to your point, is just because something is seen to be an issue, the question is, how do you reframe it to become a value? And so there's great books out there that are massively been helpful for me. Like, there's one called, I think, Reframe. There's another one that is looking at, I've got it on my thing somewhere. It's looking at the one's called What's Your Problem? There's another one that I love called Not Invented Here, that basically help with some of those framing problems. And then there's a guy called Edward de Bono who also like looks at some of those things. So it's almost like they're the skill sets. At least I think so, because I inherently biased to that space to try and to try and get.
And I mean, you've got over 20 years of experience in this field and you now have your own company. Where do you see the future of clinical trials in terms of the advancements, the challenges that may face, and like where do you see the next generation of clinical trials going?
There's probably two answers to that. Where do I think it's going, and where would I like to see it going? So where I think it's going is that the, like the last 15, 20 years since I've been in this industry, things have changed. Um, but they're also like quite marginal improvements. So if we think about like the time to deliver, that's increased. The complexity of trials, they've increased. Spoke to a guy called Craig Lipset, I think he was like innovation lead at Pfizer. And Craig asked him the question of how fast do we innovate in our industry? And he was like about 17 years. And it was quite interesting because like things like EDC, that was going to change the way that we were going to do things. And it hasn't. And I think that honestly, like you can't probably make change. You can make operational efficiency gains with the process that we have. The real changes, or the real change comes when you change the underlying process. Because as I mentioned before, is that we stack technologies on an existing process, but the real question to first ask is that process right? So like things like the why love him or hate him, Elon Musk and how he thinks is very interesting because he looked at cars, looked at rockets, and basically from a first principles perspective said, is this the way to do it if we were to start again having the technology that we have? And the answer is no. Um, so the rockets were built in different parts of the world and then shipped, and that all has cost and time and so on and so forth. The technologies were rockets I never knew this, but rockets, the width of rockets were dependent on the width of the roads because they had to be transported. So there was a constraint there that didn't need to be there. So when they started to build them at one unit, they were able to then innovate because there weren't the same constraints. And I think the same is true with research, which I think that what we will see is as we start to see things like some of the data processing innovations, some of the innovations with AI, and then access to some of the data with biology, we'll probably likely get bigger insights. And then it's a question of how do we translate those into perhaps even trialless or patientless trials in which they're like, organoids on a chip and so on and so forth. And I think that what we'll probably find is that those type of innovations will happen and speed things up. But ultimately, for this foreseeable future, I think people will need to be a part of that in some capacity until we can like synthetically create or recreate a human, and that's going to depend on each individual. So maybe we will, in the far future, we'll have our own digital version of ourselves that we can just pass through a trial, and then we get paid for that data that we produce. And then, okay, there's a drug that matches, we're interested in taking that. So.
Very interesting future. And as we get, literally just pass your data tube through and it will do the trial. It's the one way to solve
Who knows?
recruitment.
Absolutely. Who knows? I mean, I'm certainly not smart enough to forecast some of these things, but I think that it's possible. It's a possibility.
And as we sort of wrap up, I have three final questions. For someone early in their career who maybe stumbled into clinical trials like you did, or is just sort of looking at it, how would you recommend they think about entering this field?
So assuming that they're in the field already.
Either maybe they're sort of thinking about entering it. So they've seen it, they've been offered an opportunity to take part, and they're not sure.
Okay. I think where I'd start is like, what are the things that you seem to be, I'd ask myself the question, what are the things that you seem to be exceptional at that others will have typically praised you for, right? So it might be at school in which that you found it easy to do a particular, science part, bit of might be biology, or it might be physics, or whatever it may be, and try and understand what it is, because that's like a gift, right? In which that you are just programmed a particular way to operate in this way, and whether it's your environment, your genetics, and all those above. And I think it's more about like searching what are those unique characteristics of you. And then what I would look at is to see, how do you marry those up against what is available in research? So as mentioned before, is that it may be a case of you are really good at precision, and you are really good at the precision side, and you can just spend all day like being quite repetitive as well. And like a lab, whether it's a lab based and you're analytical, so lab based work might be like really good for you. Whereas if you like to be far more interacting with people, let's say, and you're always the one to arrange the parties and things like that, is that, well, maybe something in like the communications side of things may be more of your ilk. So I think it's like, it's not, I think we get things wrong where we look outer and we say, okay, what are the things that I should do? I think that the question is who are you at the core? What are the things that you are naturally good at? And then try and find a solution for that, in terms of what are the jobs that are suitable. And also leverage, like looking and trying to understand some of the big trends like AI, and how do you leverage those things, in research. That's such a big area now, and that one that everyone's talking about, but the older people like me don't necessarily understand it quite as much. So that's a massive leverage.
Thank you. And if anyone wanted to find out more about you, the work you're doing, you also have a podcast. So where can they go to find you in terms of learning more about you and your work?
Yeah, so if they can just find me on LinkedIn, Liam Eves, Eves. And then the podcasts are innovatingclinicaltrials.com, and also there's one, the endpointpodcast.com is another. And just shoot me a message through LinkedIn.
Sounds
probably
good. And I'll link all the podcasts, LinkedIn in the description. And the final question, I like to remember that people aren't just their work. So what do you like to do outside of the things that you do professionally?
My word. So I've got a sporting background, so I love sport and fitness. So I do a lot of training. I do a lot of weightlifting, and I've recently just taken up golf about 18 months ago. So I've decided in my infinite wisdom that me like almost like trying to train like a professional athlete at my age to try and play golf is a good idea. And my one piece of advice is don't do it. It's very addictive, but it's good fun. So they're my downtime things that I enjoy doing, and spending time with the family and all the usual stuff as well.
Well, thank you. Well, Liam, thank you so much. This has been such a really interesting conversation. I feel like I've learned so much about how to approach problems, navigating like just what it's like working in trials, and the importance of building trust with people as well. I really appreciate you taking the time to share your experience and perspective.
Perfect. Thanks so much for having me on, and I wish you well, and I'm sure we'll speak again soon.
Perfect. And thank you for listening to Meet the Medicine Makers. This podcast explores the people behind how medicines are made. If you found this episode useful, feel free to share it with someone who might benefit, and you can find more information about Liam and his work in the description. See you in the next episode.